welcome. This week, the 25th week of the church year, the readings, first reading from the Old Testament, prophet Amos, chapter 8, verses 4 through 7. The letter attributed to Paul to Timothy, chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, and the gospel passage from Luke, chapter 16, verse 1 through 13. We come this time to one of the most discussed and analyzed and interpreted parables, perhaps in the whole of the tradition, certainly a parable that is in many ways unique to Luke. And so I thought as we start this, and we will look a little at this, in order to explain some of the things that are going on in interpreting this parable, one might just quickly recount what this parable says. And it begins by saying that Jesus says to his disciples, so up to this point, as we have heard earlier on in chapter 15, the parables that were addressed more to the community, this one seems to have been addressed to the disciples. Now, of course, who are the disciples? You could maybe argue that the disciples are anyone who follows Jesus, but at least in that context. Jesus begins, a rich man had a steward who was reported to him as squandering his property. He summoned him and said, "What is this I hear about you?" I'll kind of just quickly summarize this. Prepare, you're going to be fired. Prepare an account of your stewardship. Well, the steward now says, to dig I'm not able, to beg I'm ashamed. I know what I'll do. And then he goes out and he calls in some of the debtors and says, how much do you owe? He says, I owe 100. He says, sit down and write your bill 50. To another, how much do you owe? 100. Sit down, write it to 80. And it ends, and this is what now is going to be important. Most scholars would agree that this particular parable ends with verse 8, which says, the master commended the dishonest steward for acting prudently. Now that's how we believe that the original parable ended. But as we will hear, there are a number of other verses which follow this, which in their own way tend to interpret. We'll look at these a little bit as we go along, but verses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 offer four different analyses of this parable, which in a certain way is very strange. Now, why is it much interpreted? Because here are some of the questions that are posed with regard to this parable and to Jesus teaching it. How can a dishonest steward be praised by his master? Who is the master? Is it Jesus? Is it a rich man? What is the economic system that is presumed behind this story? Does this concern what we call usury, which would be opposed in Jewish life, or is it the steward's commission? We'll look a little bit at some of these as we go along as possible ways in which this account is interpreted. What does squandering signify? Is the charge that is made against the steward true or false? Who are the debtors that are kind of reduced with what they owe? Is this a matter of a sympathetic character, or is whom we are talking with a villain? Is the steward someone to be emulated, that is, to be honored? Or is he simply a kind of interesting character designed to give us a chuckle in a rather comic story? And here's where I started. Where does the original parable end? Because with all the verses that are included in the reading, one isn't quite sure where one should stop, and where one stops often interprets what has gone before. So, let's look at this now once again. A rich man. Now remember in Luke's story, often riches are okay, but it's a question of how riches are used. And often Luke pictures Jesus as using a rich man as a kind of an example. In this case, the rich man apparently owns a great farm, a great system of farm, because he's being paid regularly by the two items that were very important in certainly first century world, namely olive oil and wheat. And you remember those are the two things now that will be reduced when the steward gets to work at it. Dishonest. Now, that's one of the titles of this, the parable of the dishonored steward, dishonest, or dishonest manager. If there's a rich man, what's this steward's job but is to manage things? Now, what does he manage to do? Well, we don't know. All it says, the text, is that the rich man is told that the steward has done something wrong, namely squandered his goods. Now, what does squandering mean? Well, again, in English, there are probably a number of terms by this. Has he misused his money? Has he misused the money of the owner of the field? What has he done? It would seem, by the way, that the rich man takes whoever told him that the steward has squandered his goods as truthful. We don't hear him asking the steward, is this the case or not, but simply says, it's been reported to me, no longer can this be, and you are to be let go. In other words, it's a story of the owner firing his manager on the grounds of what? Information that he has heard from whom? Who has told him this? How did he come to this? See, this is why this parable sets itself up for a number of questions and a number of ways of interpreting it. So, as we heard, and that's why I read this, as we heard, the steward says, well, what am I going to do? To dig, I'm not able. So he's really saying, I'm not the guy who gets my hands dirty doing that kind of work. To beg, I am ashamed. All right, begging. Now it's at this point when one listens to this little phrase, to beg, I'm ashamed. Keep in mind that this particular parable immediately follows the one from last time, namely the story of the prodigal son, so the prodigal father, where you remember that the prodigal son, the younger son, when he returns, is not ashamed to beg his father. He begs, saying, well, I'm not worthy to be called your son anymore, just call me a servant. So there is, again, a technique that is frequently used by Luke of paralleling. In other words, there are some things in the former parable here that might be worth looking at in the current parable that we are addressing now. So he decides that he will go to what? People who owe debtors. Now, again, the background for this is a relationship called patron with a client. The patron is the owner of this field. The client, the debtors, are those that pay the owner a certain amount of goods. It's much more a barter system than it is money, although certainly you could put monetary value here, but bartering really was more the common way of doing things in the Middle East, as in some ways it is still a custom in certain parts of the Mediterranean or the Middle Eastern world today. So, the steward's action. Well, now, what does he do? He says to one of the men, how much do you owe? Well, he says, I owe 100 oil. Now, bales of oil or containers of oil. If you have, I just looked this up, 100 bales of oil would have been worth 1,000 denarii. Now, keep in mind that that's a day's wage, so that would be worth a little over 3 years' wages a day. So 100 barrels, or however the oil was kept. 100 containers of wheat, which would probably amount to, in dollars and cents, anywhere from $2,500 to $3,000 denarii, which would have been, get this, 8 years' wages. So when we're talking about here of oil and wheat, keep in mind that there's high stakes go in terms of value. We might think, oh, well, what's a little bit of wheat? What's a little bit of oil? A lot at work here. So when the steward says to the guy who owes the 100 barrels of oil, I say barrels, I don't know, we don't really know what the oil was kept in. Could have been big sacks of some kind, but whatever it was, sit down, he says, and write your bill 50. Now, he cuts the cost that is due by the client or the debtor to the owner by half. And then, of course, the wheat is to 80 from 100. Now, here's the question. Here's where interpreters go to work on this parable. What exactly is happening here? Is the steward cheating the rich man by giving him only part of what he was due? See, so in fact, does this make him some kind of a hero, or is he some kind of a crook, or some kind of a clever, manipulator of goods here? So that's one way to look at this. But certainly you talk about being dishonest. Who is he being dishonest to, if not to the rich man, who I will call the owner, but let's say that at least he's rich enough that he's due all of the goods that come off of this property. Probably makes him the owner, but of course you could, and discussion has taken place about that too. Now another, and this is a frequently interpreted view, see, I'm going to say there's a number of different ways in which this is interpreted, is that in fact what had happened is that the manager had been told by the rich man that he expected so much from the crop this year. He had expected 100, say, barrels of oil, or 100 of sheaves of wheat. That's what he expected. Or did he? Could it be that the rich man only expected a smaller amount? Here's where it comes. What if he only expected 50 barrels of oil rather than 100? Well, what would the manager do? The manager, and this is one way of interpreting this, simply kind of said, well, I got to earn my own wage here. So when I go to the client, I'll say he owes 100. He collects the 100, gives the 50 to the rich man, which is what he was asked, and keeps the 50 himself, and likewise with regard to the wheat. Therefore, what the manager does is not cheat the rich man, nor does he really cheat the clients who have to pay this in goods, because they knew that's how the system worked. They had no choice over it. But really what he does is cut his profit. In other words, the manager says, I'll take no profit or return this time, so that then, and here's what he says, when I am out of my job, I will have friends. I will have a place to go. Now notice in life, it's very difficult not only to be jobless, but friendless. And so there's a kind of practicality that always appears in Luke's parables. So he thinks, if I'm going to lose my job, well, I'll have a place to go, because those whom I cut their bill down to the rich man too will be open-armed and welcome me. Well, that's one way certainly to interpret things, that he, therefore, is he really dishonest? Well, no, and that's why we'll look, ways of interpreting it is he's just shrewd. Now, is shrewd the same as wisdom? I don't know, someone can be wise, but to be shrewd usually means that there's some little shady things which are going on. So exactly whether that's a right way in which the manager is being addressed, again, is another point of interpretation. So, is the manager without a job necessarily? Or has he, and here's where the parable might be kind of continued, well, now that he's shown his kind of managerial skills here, is the rich man who has taken the word that dishonesty has taken place. Now, of course, there might have been real dishonesty. So you see, the interpreters kind of move around with this. And by the way, many wonder why Luke even includes this in his gospel, because it does not fit his usual pattern of things. And is it only because it has a certain parallelism to the prodigal story that this occurs? And again, that's one of those unanswered questions, or which you will find many interpreters giving different explanations as to why this is found there. So, does he get the job back? Another kind of way of interpreting this, how could the manager get away with reducing the money or the goods that was due to the rich man if it was known that he had lost his job? So is that, and there's where some interpreters say, notice that he says to the guy, sit down and write your bill hastily, quickly. Why does he do it in haste? Well, some say the reason he does this quickly is they don't know that he's lost his job. They think he's still working for the rich man. So if he does this, well, it must be all right. And now, see, here's another interpretation that comes in. The rich man is kind of caught in a dilemma. If indeed he's been taken advantage of by his manager, but if now he has cut the amount that is due to him by a certain percentage, doesn't the owner or the rich man appear in a very positive light in the eyes of those who owe him? They say, this is a wonderful year. It's like getting a tax rebate or PPP returns, as some got as a result of the COVID. You see, it's a wonderful kind of thing that the rich man has done, and he is much praised. And so the relationship between the rich man and his clients is enhanced, much like the father in that prodigal story had shown such great graciousness not only to his sons but also to the community. So some say here's a little bit more of that parallelism that's at work in Luke's story. So notice all of the different kind of aspects that you can introduce here. In some ways, you're rewriting the script of relationships between client and rich man, and certainly the manager. The manager, again, serves as a broker, if you think, between the clients who owe so much to the rich man and the rich man himself. Now, is he really dishonest? Is he really a criminal? Or is he shrewd, as I mentioned? Or is he simply wise? And if he suddenly does this when the crisis emerged, why didn't he do it before? What was going on prior to his being accused? Or again, truly he might have been guilty of that. We don't know. Okay. So all of those are some aspects to bring into this interpretation. But let me go now to the verses that follow. Remember, we probably think most do, that the parable ended in verse 8a. Now verse b picks up with the teacher, Jesus saying, "Indeed, the children of this age are more clever toward their own than those of the light." So is the words of Jesus here in telling this story saying, notice how those in business are much more clever in taking care of things, are shrewder than are the children of the light with regard to the gospel and the teaching of the gospel ways. So that particular verse could lead to, and does lead to, one way, of interpreting this parable. Verse 9 reads, "I also say to you, make friends for yourselves from the mammon of wickedness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into their eternal tents." Well, could the teaching here be that money is really a transitory thing? And there certainly is a truth to that. And that, we need to make friends. We need to establish friendships. And from the mammon of wickedness. Now the word mammon, what does that mean? Tends to be incorporating the whole of an economic system, of which, of course, money is at the heart or the basis. Verse 10, 11, and 12 are often interpreted together, but let me read them so you can kind of see how interpretation here takes place. 10, the person who is reliable in something tiny is reliable also in something greater. The one who is wicked in something tiny is wicked also in something greater. If therefore you have not become reliable in your use of wicked mammon, who will entrust you with the genuine thing? And if you have not become reliable in what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? Well, now you can see how this is interpreted. The manager was handling the affairs of the rich man. He was not reliable. He was not doing the things he said. And so this would be another interpretation of this particular parable. See how this works, that each of these different verses really leads you to a different conclusion as to the meaning of this particular parable. Verse 13, which is the last now of the verses, by the way, that we will be looking at, "No household servant," it reads, "is able to serve two masters. Either a person will hate one and love the other, or will cling to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." So again, there's that term mammon, which, by the way, appears also in Matthew's famous Sermon on the Mount, where he uses this same term. So is there certainly a truth here? Is that what Jesus is saying? You can't serve God, the things of the kingdom, the ways of the Lord, and serve the world at the same time. They are each a master. You serve one or the other, but you can't serve them both. And that is often an interpretation which is given to this parable. So as you can see, it really opens the door to a lot of ways of doing things. So quickly, just backtracking a moment, to the rich man as this begins, as I pointed out, he doesn't question the charges. What is it that I hear about you? He gives no explanation as to why this would be the case. Give an account of your managing. The manager's is given no chance to explain. At least if I accuse you of something, most of us would say, "No, wait a minute, let me explain." Well, that doesn't happen here. And you are no longer able to manage. So just like that, the guy becomes unemployed and becomes literally and by the way, in Luke's story, remember how there's always a connection between rich and poor. He immediately becomes a member of the poor, not only out there on the streets, but literally have no money. So what I've tried to show today, as we looked at this, that this and none of these interpretations, by the way, satisfy everyone, okay? So that there are a number of, if there are interpretations of sections of Luke's gospel, this is one that gets a lot of ink. And that's why we spent a little bit of time today looking at some of the ways in which this has been interpreted. But whichever one you hear this time, as it's homilized, probably is one of the correct ones, but it overlooks some aspects that maybe would be important to notice. In conclusion, the first reading comes from the prophet Amos, who is the first of the great classical prophets. He writes sometime between the year 786 to 742 before the Common Time. He's the first of the writing prophets. As you know, in the collection in the Hebrew Bible, there are a number of prophets. Amos is one of them. And he is arguing in the little section that we hear this time against those who oppress the poor. So once again, this idea of poor becomes very strong. He flags against tradesmen and merchants whom he accuses of oppressing the poor. Now he gets very particular in this little section. This is called an oracle of judgment, where he says that there are those out there, those merchants, who can't wait until the Sabbath or a new moon appears. Sabbath, as you know, began on Friday night. All commerce was to stop. All movement of commercial activity was not to take place. But Amos says, but these guys are sitting there on the Sabbath day plotting how they can take advantage of others when the market opens again. They'll fix, the term is used, a shekel. Well, how can we load it to make it, if you think, remember the old days when you had a scale on both sides? Well, how can I make it go just a little bit so that it becomes unequal on the other side? And it talks about an epoch, and an epoch is usually 62 ounces or barrels, quarts rather, in a bushel. Well, can I fix the bushel a little so that the amount is, cheating the poor? There's a kind of false bottom. So all of this is really what Amos is ranting against. He rants against those, rightly so, those who take advantage of those who come to the marketplace, because you have no way to really, if you want the item, you got to pay what the ongoing price is. Again, saying barter, but that would be the way in which it would take place. Prophet says, God will never forget the greedy assault of those on the poor. And interestingly says, this is kind of typical in some ways of prophetic talk, will punish those who do this, this, with earthquakes, eclipses, deprivation, famine. If you do these things to the poor, and by the way, I don't want to miss this, he says, you will buy and sell the debtor for silver, or the poor for a pair of sandals. How bad can you get? Now, I understand why we think this section from Amos is used for our consideration this time, but it also makes an assumption, and maybe that we need to be careful. Amos certainly is arguing against merchants who take advantage of the poor. As we've tried to show up today, it's not necessarily true about the steward in the parable that Jesus tells. Is he taking advantage of the poor? See, so there, although it's supposed to match a little bit and get our attention, and certainly God is concerned about the poor, and we should be, but that may not exactly fit with the understanding of the parable. Well, good luck in listening to and interpreting this parable this week. Glad that you are with us. Hope to see you again.